everyone. So for the hackathon yesterday, I was working with Elliot Morris from The Economist, Connor Phillips, who's a grad student here at Harvard, Duchin Rana from the Data Trust, and myself, who's a junior at Harvard, studying government and statistics. And so our primary questions going into yesterday were whether electoral politics are fundamentally different post-Trump, and whether long-term trends that might have been happening have continued post-2016, or whether there's something different going on in politics. So that's what we really wanted to look at, given the data. And so on this plot here, you see the Clinton share in 2016 minus the Obama share in 2012 on the x-axis, and then the Democratic Senate share in 2018 minus the Democratic Senate share in 2012 on the y. And what you see here primarily is a nationalization effect. So the same things that are happening in 2016 versus 2012 in the presidential election are happening in 2018 versus 2012 in the Senate election. So those are mirroring those national presidential elections. And you can see here the different states are the different plot points, and different colors are by region, and the size is depending on the population in the district, in the county, rather. But what we see here is that the Democratic Senate candidates outperformed Clinton, but mostly in smaller Trump swingy states here. So what you see when you look at a plot like this is maybe a mean reversion hypothesis. So there are counties that traditionally vote Democrat, but swung to Trump in the 2016 presidential election. And then in the top left-hand corner, we see that in the Senate elections in 2018, they're reverting back to how they traditionally vote democratically. So this is in some rural places like West Virginia with candidates like Joe Manchin. But what we see is that in the bottom right-hand corner, we're not seeing that same process of reversion for the Republicans. So places that traditionally voted for candidates like Romney but didn't vote for Trump are not really reverting back in the same magnitude to Senate Republican candidates as the Democratic candidates. So that leads us to think something strange might be going on. But then when you look at this plot, it suggests that maybe Clinton is a special case and not really a great comparison. So when we see the relationship between how Obama performed compared to Senate candidates in 2012 versus how Clinton performed in 2016 compared to if this year's election in the Senate happened in 2016, which we modeled based off of how the relationship between Obama and Senate candidates in 2012, really there is no relationship. You can't predict what's going on, which means that something strange is happening now that is different from the relationship between presidential elections and the Senate that has happened in the past. Yeah. Does anyone have a question?
What do you think this is?
I think that it's really hard to know what is going on, but I think that what we can tell is that there's a difference between how the Democratic Party is operating now, perhaps, than it was in 2012, or at least the way that the elections happened in 2018 suggests that we have not reverted back to 2012 trends for the way that the Democratic Party is moving. But we don't really, it's hard to tell why and whether that's going to hold because we're only at one election out. Yeah. So it's my pleasure to introduce the next panel, which will be on gerrymandering data and fairness, which will be moderated by Guy-Uriel Charles, who's a professor of law at Duke Law School and is a visiting professor at Harvard Law School, also the co-director of the Duke Law Center on Law, Race, and Politics. And our panelists will be Stephen Ansolabehere, who's a professor of government and the director for the Center for American Political Studies at Harvard, Moon Duchin, an associate professor of math at Tufts, who leads the Metric, Geometry, and Gerrymandering group, which studies the relationship between geometry and redistricting. Ben Ginsberg, a partner at Jones Day, who is nationally known for political law advocacy and representing parties and campaigns, was also the national counsel on the Bush-Cheney campaign. and Allison Riggs, who's a staff attorney with the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, where she focuses on voting rights and environmental justice and has also litigated redistricting cases on behalf of state and NAACP conferences. So thank you very much.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you for sticking with us with this last panel. In some respects, you can think of this as applied data analytics. We're going to look at the interrelationship of the analytics question, the data question with some legal issues that are happening on the ground. And we obviously have a great expert panel to help us out. So we're first going to set everything up with understanding the parameters, the legal parameters in particular. And Allison's going to start us off with by providing both some table setting as well as some analysis so that we can understand the interaction of the legal questions that are posed by the question of political gerrymandering with then the math and the political science and how the numbers and the analytics come into play. So Allison, if you will, please start us off.
Great. Thank you all for having me today. I'm from the state of North Carolina, and I think the thread through our conversation today is going to be North Carolina Congressional District 12. And I think talking about the history of that district will give you a little bit of context for how the legal jurisprudence has changed. For a very long period of time, for hundreds of years, we weren't able to elect African American representatives to Congress. The U.S. Congress amended Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in the early 1980s to finally give it some teeth and to allow us to create districts in which black voters would be able to elect their candidates of choice. And the Supreme Court interpreted that in a 1986 case. So in the first round of redistricting, where we had a Section 2 that meant something, that we could use to create districts that would allow the election of African-American preferred representatives, we saw the creation of majority black districts, and they weren't always the prettiest shape. So in the 1990s, there was a series of cases and litigation challenging the creation of these majority black districts because they were very oddly shaped. In many of these states, the levels of racially polarized voting were very high. White voters were only voting for white candidates, and black voters were only voting for black candidates, and black voters were in the minority. So to get a district where black voters had a chance, you got some interesting shaped districts. The Supreme Court struck down many of those districts. They said, you know, we're suspicious of legislation, redistricting plans are legislation, we're suspicious of legislation that segregates voters on the basis of race and says black voters go here and white voters go here. So North Carolina was at the forefront of that litigation. Shaw v. Reno is the seminal case, and we kept litigating and kept litigating. In North Carolina, Congressional District 12, a very early version of it, the 2011 version isn't actually the ugliest version, if you can believe. The 92 version stretched from Charlotte, which is down sort of where the bottom of where the 9 is, all the way up to Durham. But after some cases, that got cleaned up. It was still a district that stretched from Charlotte to Greensboro, so it was always long and skinny. One of the jokes about the district was you could drive down I-85 with your car doors open, and that would be the entire width of the district. It was capturing some black population in Greensboro and some black population in Charlotte. But the 1992 districts led to the election of 2 African-American members of Congress, the first since Reconstruction, and it was a big deal. And the districts got cleaned up, neatened up, the black voting age population reduced, but it was still able to elect candidates of choice of black voters. Fast forward 20 years, North Carolina has changed a lot demographically. We've seen a lot of transplants, people moving in, the state becoming more progressive, becoming what folks call us a swing state now, a purple state. And we've seen levels of racially polarized voting decrease. And during the 2011 redistricting process, the Republicans had taken over the legislature in 2010, so they controlled completely redistricting in 2011. And they said, we need to draw congressional districts 1 and 12, which were the districts that elected black candidates, but were no longer majority black districts. we need to draw them as majority black districts to comply with the Voting Rights Act. That meant drawing them even more crazy shaped, drawing them to dramatically increase the black voting age population. The civil rights groups, which I am a part of, we defended against the charges of racial gerrymandering in the 1990s. We wanted to create these districts that would create opportunity for black voters. But we didn't want, particularly with the passage of time and the changing of voting patterns, we didn't want Section 2 to be cynically applied, misapplied, to pack black voters into as few districts as possible. And so we objected during the legislative process, particularly to Congressional District 12. It was in the upper 40% black voting age population, and they drew it up to 52%, and it became substantially less non-compact. And it was represented then by Mel Watt, who said, I don't need this. No candidate needs this. And so this is what's interesting about redistricting litigation is we sort of got to flip hats. Like we were defending against claims of racial gerrymandering in the 1990s, and this time we said, no, these are racial gerrymanders. These are segregating voters on the basis of race. The Supreme Court said that's problematic, and we don't want to do that. And this was litigation that was successful this cycle. It was successful in the congressional districts in North Carolina and the state legislative districts in North Carolina. Then we get to the fix, right? So the legislature, the North Carolina legislature, in its very mature fashion says, fine, I can't use race, I'll flip the race button off. Just to be clear, you can use race in redistricting. We wouldn't have Section 2 if you couldn't use race in redistricting. You can't use race in a predominant fashion. It can't be the main reason you're deciding how to draw a line, but you can be aware of it. You can take it into account. There is a legal way to use race. The legislature said, I'm going to switch the race button off. And in fact, the head Republican in the redistricting process, in the remedial process in 2016, when he was coming up with the 2016 plan, got up in front of committee and said, I am drawing a partisan gerrymander because it is not illegal. And I admit this is a partisan gerrymander. And our previous plans that were invalidated produced a delegation that was 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats, even though we're pretty close to 50-50 state. He said, I'm going to keep that. My sole goal is to draw a 10-3 plan again. And in fact, I would draw an 11-2 plan if I could, but it's not physically possible in this state. So he said, this is a max Republican plan that I'm drawing. Is it more compact? Yes. Is it prettier to look at? Yes. Although, with those of us who draw districts, it's always in the eye of the beholder. But we litigated this. We brought partisan gerrymandering cases. There are 2 cases. They've been consolidated and were likely to be heard in the Supreme Court this term. But one thing to sort of understand about the story we were telling to the court, and we won in front of a 3-judge panel of Republican and Democratic appointed judges. I think one thing that might interest you all is we ran simulations, so computer-drawn maps that didn't consider political data, but considered traditional redistricting criteria, thousands and thousands and thousands, and not one of them produced a 10-3 plan. Not one. So that tells us something. That tells us that this can't happen by accident. It can only happen with intent and purpose. And so that's, sort of where we're starting to, and, obviously I'm in a room with brilliant data folks. I could talk about all the different ways we look at and measure partisan asymmetry and how we're trying to tell the court that this isn't social science gobbledygook. It's real math and science, and we can do something with this. But this doesn't happen by accident, and it's not, to the extent we're seeking fairness and representation. This isn't getting us there. So now this is the new ballgame.
Before turning it over to Steve, can you just tell us what's the legal standard that the court has to apply that then has to be translated by the mathematicians or the political scientists and trying to understand what fairness means from a computational perspective. But first, the legal standard.
So there's two main competing theories. There's actually more, but the two main ones are that this is an equal protection problem, that this is wasting and devaluing the votes of Democratic voters. In this case, it's Republican voters in other states where Democrats are drawing it. That gives rise to an equal protection. My vote's
There's a
not.
vote dilution question?
I think of it, and the theory that we're pushing analogizes it to the one person, one vote case, where you have to have equally populated districts so that my vote counts about the same as your vote. And so I think that's a useful and helpful way to think about it, and it's a jurisprudence that's existed since the 60s that the court should be comfortable with. The other one is a First Amendment theory, that this is in fact governments punishing voters for essentially speech, voting. Whether voting is speech, we'll get someday. We'll talk about that. But it's governmental action punishing voters because they vote Democrat. So limiting their power, limiting their voice because of the way they're voting. So those are the two main threads, whether the court wants to go down a equal protection route or a First Amendment route. Both will be on the menu for them to decide if the North Carolina case goes up this term.
Okay. So Steve, just to now bring you into this conversation to help us understand how we can translate the legal framework and to prove either vote dilution or to show that discriminatory intent, that is, this did not happen by chance, that this was in fact what was intended by the legislature. So what is the role that the data folks can play in helping us think about the political gerrymandering question?
So when me or people like me are enlisted by Ben or Allison or some other...
Say enlisted, how about paid?
Oh, yeah.
There are many ways of enlisting.
It's not pro bono.
In fact, you don't want to be pro bono. You want to... So we'll be approached. The first case this cycle that I worked on was actually the Texas case, Perez v. Perry, which eventually became Perez v. Abbott. And I was working for the Rodriguez plaintiffs, and I was approached by an attorney in Texas named Renee Hicks. And the lawyer presents the questions that they want answered. Like, what are you looking for? Well, we've got this Section 5 case, we've got a Section 2 case, and well, what does that mean, and what evidence are you looking for? And the discussion usually starts where the lawyers put the questions to the academics. Usually it's put in a broad way, and in some settings the guidance is clear because of prior court cases. In other settings it's not clear because maybe there isn't any prior court work. And they're usually looking for three kinds of evidence: evidence of intent, intentional discrimination; evidence of effect, that the act had an effect on different groups, it was a disparate effect; and some sort of remedy. And intent's super hard to show. Effect is usually much easier to show. And remedy's got this kind of interesting role, and it changed, I think, this cycle, where remedy, in particular, coming into court with a demonstration map went from something you didn't do to something you were expected to do. So in 2011, like, don't do that. And by 2015, if you don't have a demonstration map, i.e. a remedy, that tells the court where to go, you're not going to make much traction. There's also state and federal law. So I worked on the Florida case for the Romo plaintiffs and Romo v. Detzner under state law. The Pennsylvania case was a state law case where the states have their own criteria, their own standards. Sometimes they're completely unconnected to the federal standards, and sometimes they try to parallel the federal standards. And then the federal law largely falls under the Voting Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. In terms of the analytics in the courtroom, there are, I think, 5 big bins, at least, that I work in and have encountered in the redistricting setting. One is just voting behavior. How are people voting? And that's what Allison alluded to with racial block voting. Are whites voting one way, blacks voting another way? Are they polarized? Are they voting opposite each other? Are the population statistics such that blacks alone could be drawn into a district so they live close to each other that would function as a district? So those aspects of voting behavior are important to establish at the first step. And all of this is about race. Very little is understood really about party in terms of what the legal criteria are and the guidance to an expert, because there's been so little litigation
Although
at the federal level.
that's currently the question on the table.
Yeah,
right?
but at the state level, like the Florida case, there was a lot of evidence brought to bear. There's also a very interesting, complicated difference between a situation like North Carolina, where you have two races, black versus white, and say Texas or Florida, where you have three or more races, black, white, Hispanic. Well, do the Hispanics and blacks vote together? Are they cohering in the primaries? All those become new and interesting questions that even in the racial litigation are still being sorted out. Second kind of evidence is electoral effects of individual districts or maps. So we go through and we try to figure out, is this district, if the intent was to draw a district that would function, say, for blacks in this area, is it actually going to function that way? Are the black preferred candidates in races from, say, past elections winning in this reconstituted configuration of the geography? And there have been important cases, especially in Texas, where districts have been put together and they don't function because what was done was they put a lot of Hispanic adults in the district, but they weren't citizens, so they couldn't actually elect their preferred candidates. Who wins and who will likely win is this kind of very gray area in the court, and a lot of what we heard earlier about predicting elections and the complications of predicting elections come right into the courtroom. Like, how much certainty do we really have that, say, Texas 23 is going to function for the Hispanic citizenship? Third thing are examining the actual boundary changes. What was very important in the North Carolina case, I worked for the plaintiffs in the racial case, was examining the voting tabulation districts and precincts on the margin that were moved in and moved out. And studying those became evident that predominantly black precincts were moved in, predominantly white precincts were moved out. And if you looked more closely, race was the main predictor, not party, of which boundary changes were moved. And that became kind of critical evidence. In the Florida case, we were able to follow boundary changes. There they have an anti-party gerrymandering provision, and we're able to show that between versions of a map, like amended version 26, amended version 27, they made these swaps of these precincts and went from 2 competitive districts to 2 Republican-leaning districts. The fourth category of evidence is demonstration maps. I think this is like a huge change in where the analytics, especially the GIS world, has completely changed the courtroom. Before, if you went back to the 80s or the 90s even, nobody had access to software, all right? It was the staff of the majority party in the committee that drew the district, or maybe the staff of the party organization outside the legislature that drew the district and sent it into the state legislature, that had control of the data, had access to the map-making software and technology. 2000s come, we start to get map-making technology, start to be used by the minority party in the legislature. There's a lot of hand-wringing about how that's creating ugliness in maps, and this is horrible. 2010 cycle comes around, and now you have people coming to court from different perspectives. NAACP has a map, MALDEF has a map, LULAC has a map. Everybody has an idea of what they want the settlement to be, and that actually defines the parameters of what a negotiation would look like in a court, because a lot of these courts are actually saying, here's what the legislature intended, we've got these problems in these spots, here's what this group wants, can we come to an agreement? It's hard to come to an agreement over something as contentious as this, but I think that's what the courts are looking at. And we even now have freeware. Dave's redistricting app was a tremendous asset. Like, it just helped you like draw rough drafts of maps. Like, oh, how close can I get? How can I rethink the way things were done and show that things can be done differently? And the courts really want these demonstration maps. So having that technical ability, drawing a map inside an organization is really quite powerful. And the fifth category, which we saw, and I think it's had mixed reviews, are simulated maps. So in the Florida case, John Roden and Joey Chen came in, simulated a jillion maps. The other side brought Nolan McCarty from Princeton. He critiqued that approach. By the end, hours and hours and hours were spent analyzing maps, and not one word in the court's opinion about these maps. Nothing, zero. It didn't matter, because it was hard for the court to actually make heads or tails of what this simulated stuff was.
We've gotten better about explaining it
I
to them.
think you've gotten better at explaining it, but there are some questions about whether the maps are answering the question that the court wants answered. For example, how does a simulated map answer the question of predominance? Is this predominantly race or predominantly party? It's usually an either or. How does it answer that? It's like not very direct. So the court wants to answer a question, and the expert has to come in and answer that question. And simulated maps still don't fit into that framework. Final comment, though, is that it's a lot of information, and it's a lot to sort through, and time is short, and so forth. And oftentimes you're answering like disparate, fractured questions. But what really matters, I think, for the expert is whether or not the data all coheres. Does it indicate a coherent story, or is it a little this and a little that? When the expert reports a little this, a little that, it fails. It just falls flat. But if what emerges from the expert report is a coherent story, then I think the expert analytics start to matter. And it's not that the expert comes in with the purpose of telling a story or of supporting the person who's hired them, but whether or not the data actually, what emerges from the data is a coherent story that points to a reasonable remedy.
Excellent. Moon, let's bring you in, especially on the political gerrymandering stuff. In the last few years, you've become an important player as a mathematician and helping us to think about how to bring certain analytical tools to bear to think through how to draw fairer, better maps that does not favor one party or another. Is that a fair way of thinking about it? Why don't you come into the conversation and tell us about what you're doing and how you think through these questions?
Sure, absolutely. Okay, so first of all, my background is in pure math, geometry and topology. My dissertation was about random walks in 30-dimensional spaces of surfaces. Now I work full-time on random walks in the space of districting plans. So it's a great opportunity to take what turns out to be really beautiful, cutting-edge research level math and apply it. So I want to talk a little bit about, so first thing I want to do is implore you, never strike the term simulated map from your vocabulary. Because they're real plans, and I think the right term to use and the one that dovetails best with how the technology fits into the bigger scientific computing picture is sampling, not simulation. So there are these vast spaces of possible districting plans. I'm going to give you a sense of how vast in a second. And then all of these computer techniques try to get at like a viewpoint into that big space of possibilities. And you really win if you can sample representatively from that space. And I'll try to talk a little bit about why I think that's actually, I would paint a rosier picture of the legal success. In the North Carolina case, my colleague Jonathan Mattingly of Duke did a Markov chain Monte Carlo search that sampled from the space of plans. And that was regarded very favorably as evidence in that case. In the Pennsylvania redistricting, MCMC approaches came up repeatedly. Wes Pegden testified about it in the state court case. I was a consultant for the governor on the redistricting process and also based an analysis on this kind of sampling. So let me tell you a little bit about how the story it's supposed to tell from my point of view. Okay, I want to come back to North Carolina, but I want to start with an easier state to think about, which is this one. Here we are in Massachusetts. So we have, at the moment, we have 9 congressional districts here in Massachusetts. And if you look at statewide voting patterns, let's put governors aside. We're really weird about our governors, right? But if you look at Senate and presidential voting patterns here in Massachusetts, you see a pretty consistent picture that you get 30 to 40% Republican voters. So if that's the case, and if that's, oh, and by the way, I want to talk about congressional districts, but I can't really talk about congressional election results because we really like uncontested races here. We had 4 out of 9 uncontested this time, 5 out of 9 last time. So it's, if you want statewide data, it's good to look at Senate or President. Okay, so we've got like a third or more Republican voters. Maybe we'd expect 3 out of 9 Republican House members, right? We have not elected a Republican to the House since 1994. That's a whole lot of attempts without ever sending a Republican to Washington in that time. This seems like evidence of gerrymandering, maybe you'd say, or that maybe the Republicans should just be fielding more candidates. But actually something else is going on here in Massachusetts. So this is kind of fun, new research that my group's done that I want to tell you about. We looked at 20 years worth of Senate and President election returns, and we were able to prove mathematically, completely 100%, rigorous proof, ask me about it, I'd love to tell you about it. It is,
Says the mathematician.
so, yeah, there's nothing I love to do more than geek out about proofs. But for many of those elections, even with 35% of the vote going to the Republican, it is literally impossible to build a Republican congressional district. Even with perfect omnipotence and omniscience, you can't do it. You can't arrange the precincts into, even if you throw out contiguity and you let a fractal dust count as a district, right? You actually can't make one. So how many possibilities are there in this case? Well, I can't tell you because the computers can't do it. So I can tell you that for a 9x9 grid, so that's got 81 pieces, if you try to build that into 9 districts, there are over 700 trillion ways to do it. Massachusetts has more than 2,000 precincts, not 81 chunks, but 2,000. So there are a really unthinkable number of possible plans, more plans than there are particles in the galaxy, and none of them sends a Republican to. All right, so
You're giving Ben hives, by the way, with all of this.
It's good to be with my base.
Okay, so that's just a dramatic extreme. But in general, why do this sampling? Because there can be real surprises in what's possible. It's not always proportional representation. That may not be possible. It's not, your intuitions about fairness may not always be realizable. And so I think this sampling really helps answer a fundamental question, which is a gerrymander, that's supposed to be the impermissible use of your authority to squeeze out extra advantage for your party or to disenfranchise a racial group. But impermissible has to be measured against the universe of what's possible. That's the argument about what sampling can do for us. So, and I do want to say, I want to agree with Allison, there have been huge breakthroughs in the last few years and even months and even weeks. This is very exciting, I think. We're able more and more to sample representatively to get good certificates that even though there may be 10 to the 30 possible plans, that with as few as 10 or 20,000 runs of MCMC, you can really get a very good sense of what's out there. And that allows you to say, this plan is an outlier. And that's what Mattingly's analysis shows in North Carolina, coming back to that, which I think is really interesting. The 2011 plan, huge partisan outlier. The 2016 plan looks great and is just as much of an outlier. And that's the kind of sentence that's licensed by this viewpoint of the world of possibilities, if that's making some sense. Okay, so the few points that I wanted to be sure to hit just in these opening comments, you can't judge what's impermissible without knowing what's possible, right? And I think that's really important. Getting the sampling right is hard, but it's improving, really rapidly, actually. Not all computer approaches are created equal. And I really want to say, computer plus random doesn't equal representative, right? And the math here is actually really, it's at the research frontier, and it's really hard and interesting. But there are more and more, there's a growing community of people in math and scientific computing who are working on this, and the science is getting better at an astonishing rate. And then the last point, which actually echoes a lot of what you've been hearing already, data transparency is really underrated in the ability to do this kind of analysis. Step 0 is to know where the votes are, right? And that's shockingly hard to do in a lot of states. So when I did this work for the Pennsylvania governor this January and February, I thought, oh great, hired by the governor, I'm gonna have access to all the best data. And wow, the state doesn't know where its own precincts are in Pennsylvania, no kidding. And in a lot of states, neither does Massachusetts know where its precincts are. So, so there's sort of grueling work to do there. In this election cycle, we have at least 3, and maybe when Utah ever finishes counting, possibly 4 states that approved redistricting reform measures right at the level of the voters. And you know, they've taken an interesting state-by-state approach to what they're looking for in terms of redistricting reform. One thing that I think is really important and we rarely see is data transparency as part of a reform measure. One state that got it really, really right is New Jersey. New Jersey actually put data transparency right into its redistricting reform language, and I think that's really important and something that I'd like to see going forward.
Thank you. Ben, that's all I need to say.
Thank you very much for having me. I'd like to, most of my work in redistricting, all of my work in redistricting, has been actually representing elected representatives and sort of how they approach redistricting, which I think will put in context the really excellent presentations on the law and the expertise and the math behind this. I should kind of self-confess at the beginning that of all the things I've done in election law, redistricting is really the most fascinating because it combines sort of the passion play of human nature with a lot of math and a lot of different considerations in a rare way. I geeked out on it so much that when it came time to buy the family pooch, we of course named her Gerrymander. My kids being kids insisted on calling her Mandy. I stuck with Gerrymander. But at any rate, this is clearly a process that is just terrific to be a part of if you ever get the opportunity to do it. I do think that as you're looking at the particular districts, it's really important to look at the state as a whole first and recognize that the most important line in any map that gets drawn is the first line. It tells you where you're starting, what your top priority is, and kind of what you want to achieve. Now, the improvements that Moon talked about, which are great and vast, probably mean that first line is the product of looking at far more than the map drawers who even drew that one have been able to. So that the options for, I'm sorry, that one, I'm just looking at the reflection in the mirror. Don't mind me. There's no monitor, we got the mirrors, the windows. So that the first line has many more options, but is really important because it tells you where you have to start. If you are a map drawer in any state, looking at the state as a whole, you have certain values that you want to bring. Inevitably, this is a political process, and the people in all the states except the ones with commissions, and I'd actually argue in oftentimes the commission states too, have a political objective at the beginning. And it's important to realize that every line that you draw on a map has a political implication for the people who are divided up by where that line goes. So the notion that this can become a non-political process without political ramifications for the people who actually live in a state, you should treat with a fair degree of skepticism, because even with commissions, these are political decisions in which you do. The notion of equal population has forced some of these weird lines, because the reality is that if you're trying to draw a map and you're required, as you are on the congressional level, to have equal population, you're going to have some really weird-looking districts to be able to get that population correct.
It's exactly equal.
Exactly equal.
You deviate by no more than one person.
One.
In the West Virginia case, they said
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are always exceptions because
every year, every cycle, they make a new rule.
every year one state does it a little bit differently, and then they get brought into line for the next redistricting. The voting rights implications of the state have since the 1990s really often govern the first line that you have to draw. Because what line drawers will do is look at the requirements of the Voting Rights Act, because that's the quickest way to get a map thrown out, is not to comply with that. So that the issue that you need to deal with in states like North Carolina, but really all states, is not the notion that you have to create the districts that comply with the Voting Rights Act, but exactly what the minority population in those districts is. And that's part of the political decision-making. The law's jumping all over the place, probably going to get a new set of laws. It's not like the Constitution has changed in the last 50 years. It's that the fifth justice on the Supreme Court has changed in the last 50 years. And that's kind of important to realize in whatever rules the map drawers are trying to play with. Each state does have a different set of supposedly neutral redistricting criteria. So some states will emphasize compactness, some will say continuity, preservation of communities of interest. The definition of what a community of interest is also different from every state and essentially part of a really political process. Again, the options that you're drawing, the vast numbers of them, take into account communities of interest, I think, but it's also redefining what the term means in a way that's likely to be the subject of future lawsuits. The sophistication of the data is really borne out in what everyone said about the differences in North Carolina in the 2011 map and the 2016 map. It is true that if you look at the numbers, they have produced the same electoral results, 10-3 Republican. Maryland's managed to do it the opposite way with their maps, but the neatness of the districts is proof that we're getting far more sophisticated with data, and that when Steve and I started drawing maps in the 1980s, these were big pieces of butcher block paper on a wall with magic markers, and now we're doing 10 to the 30th power worth of maps. So life has changed a lot. It's a lot of paper. And that...
For those transparencies?
Oh, yeah, and a lot of magic markers too. And for people like me that can't really draw within the lines, it's really problematic to be a redistrictor. So I want to leave you with the notion that this at its root is still votes of either a legislature or a commission, and a very human process because of that. And I think that's important to keep in mind as you follow the way the districts are drawn and the way things go through the courts, and why things ultimately change. And as gerrymandered as many states are, remember that since 2000, we've actually had 3 complete changeovers of the U.S. House of Representatives. So the sort of virtue of having different viewpoints reflected in your maps, as badly gerrymandered as those districts were, there's still been that constant turnover. And here in 2018, we had the highest voter turnout than we have ever had in a midterm election. It's towards the end of a decade. That is not the time that you would normally expect a massive turnover. So the question, and this is really a question for Steve, is that do you credit the districts that were drawn with that great turnout, or was there another reason that prompted the turnout? Go ahead, say it.
Well, I can't help but say that Trump generated enormous anxiety, enthusiasm, whatever it is, that single-handedly increased turnout in midterm elections to its highest in 50 years since 1966. So Trump's had a very good effect on American democracy.
Even with the gerrymandered maps. He now owes me a drink, by the way.
Let me ask all of you.
I always seem to owe you a drink.
And you always come through.
It's going to graduate to dinner soon. Let me ask all of you this question. It picks up something that you've said, Ben, which is that you said this is a political process. So I want to ask about that, because there's a difference between it being political and it being partisan. And then there's also the question of what is the role that the math and the numbers and the analytics can help us to think about, can make it much less, certainly much less partisan, and maybe much less political in terms of intent, right? So the effects are certainly going to be there. There's no doubt about that, that the way that you draw the lines is going to have political effects. No doubt there. But it's not clear that, that the process either has to be partisan or that the process itself has to be political. And it seems that one of the promises of the analytics is that you can hand that over to the Moons and the Steves of the world and say, okay, what we want are these criteria, and not have a political process in the way that we currently have now. So let me pose that and get the four of you to weigh in on that question.
Well, I'm gonna answer the difference between political and partisan. It is a political human nature process, in that I think we've all seen in doing maps that if there is an airport in a city, there is a huge political fight amongst all the representatives in that area to get a piece of the airport, because it's considered very good to have an airport, or a sports stadium, or a rich neighborhood with donors. So that the politics of that is not necessarily a partisan effect. Mm-hmm. Redistricting is, I think, nonetheless a partisan effort, and I'm not sure you can ever take that out of it. And I would use the illustration of the New Jersey Commission for the legislative map in the last go-round in 2011. The process there is you've got 5 Republicans named to it, 5 Democrats, and then they have to agree on the 11th member. The 11th member, I should not say this in the halls of academe, but the 11th member is always an academician from New Jersey. And so they chose a distinguished political scientist. There was an initial meeting, and we went down to his institute to meet him, and his first words when we all filed in, 10 people from each side, was, "Wow, we've never had so many Republicans here." That was a bad sign, as it turned out, because the map, in fact, we thought came out through this supposedly neutral, very much heralded commission program, is one where in the next gubernatorial election, Chris Christie won something like 60% of the votes, and one assembly seat, only one assembly seat, and no Senate seats switched. That is a gerrymandered map in what was supposedly a nonpartisan process. So I think you have to look at the actual drawing of lines as always having partisan ramifications.
Partisan ramifications, but partisan intention. If the
And
two of you would like to
intention.
weigh in on there, and then Allison, you could come in and sweep.
I think it's interesting. So people are thinking and rethinking, especially with the changeover in the Supreme Court, about the different theories that they want to advance. There's the 14th Amendment versus First Amendment question. Kagan gave some guidance in the Whitford decision about what she thought might be a good way forward, and there's a lot of debate. People are thinking it through. Some people think that you can use, so I'm very oriented to the sampling approach. I think it actually represents a substantial breakthrough that I hope will continue the success it's been having in court. And there's some interesting debate about whether you can use this sampling approach to speak to results, intent, or both.
Sure. Does it promise, is there the possibility that the sampling approach will make the process less partisan, both as to intent and obviously as to effect? Because I think that hinges on the legal question. I don't think we're going to get the conservative justices on the court to go along with thinking that political gerrymandering is both justiciable and that there is, it's covered by the Constitution. If they believe that, look, this is going to be inherently a political and partisan process, no matter how it is structured and no matter what the remedies might look like. So what's the promise here of the data analytics to help us think through that question?
Well, I mean, a few thoughts on that. One is a lot of the redistricting reform has been really process-oriented. It's been about who's on the commission, where do they come from, and who picks them. And I think independent commissions are great, but redistricting is still hard, right? And you could have the most balanced and well-meaning commission, and you still want to know something about how the plan performs relative to all the possibilities. So I think a lot of the process-oriented reforms only get you partway there. So what I think, facts like, here's how many votes you had, here's the share of votes a party had, and here's its share of seats, and it's so different. Like, thinking of that as prima facie evidence of gerrymandering doesn't work very well, and that's what I was trying to illustrate with the Massachusetts example, right? So the point there is something about the political geography of the way Republicans are scattered around Massachusetts makes them very hard to represent, impossible even. And that's just because they're extremely uniform. So it turns out that here in Massachusetts, Republicans, the statewide share is just about the same as the share in each town and the share in each precinct. It's extremely uniform. And if you think about it, that uniformity alone means you don't have enough Republican majority building blocks to put together a district from. Does that make sense? But Oregon has a similar proportion of Republicans. But you absolutely can represent them because it has to do with whether they're spatially segregated and whether there's enough variance in the vote share, and there is. So you see what I mean? You need, you need a rigorous way to build the right counterfactual, I think, to get at both results and intent.
Thank you. Steve?
So I guess I'd step back a step further. We're mostly talking about what's going on in court. I think the important part's what's going on in the legislature, and the role of the court is and ought to be kind of setting out there as we're going to enforce the laws as they exist in state law or the federal law. And my fear is that the courts want to pull back. They always want to get out of this. They just don't want to be dragged into this. If the courts aren't present as part of the process, as part of the political process in the United States, I think that would allow state legislatures, D or R, to misbehave, and plenty of history to that effect. The new techniques of map drawing, whether they're sampled or simulated, which is Rodin's favorite term, or drawn by a group and brought in as part of their political process and negotiated in the legislature, ought to be an important part of the next phase. There are other pieces of this, like state legislatures would come into court and say, yeah, it's a racial question, but we never looked at any racial data and stuff like that. And it's like, really? You never looked at the things you're supposed to look at for Section 2 compliance? And there's just a lot of basic things that are not being adhered to and done in the process. And I think that those need to be pushed along further. And it's the legislative process, not just the legal process.
So I agree that this is always going to be a political process. And in fact, I want it to be at least a somewhat political process because I believe in transparency and accountability. I don't want someone like Wizard of Oz behind the curtain drawing the map. I don't want the robots, the machines drawing the maps. I want affected voters to have a voice in it. But to Steve's point, the courts want the way out, and it's too easy to say, well, it's always political, that, toss my hands up. And the analogy I use that I think works for people who have kids is, kids fight, they squabble, right? So Aaron and Cooper are squabbling over a toy, it's kids being kids, I'm not gonna intervene. Cooper punches Aaron, I'm like, maybe I'll intervene. Cooper kicks Aaron in the face. I'm going to intervene. I think most people are going to intervene at that point. Cooper takes a brick and hits Aaron in the head. Everyone's going to intervene at that point, right? And if we don't parent, if we don't intervene, right, then it's like bricks to everyone's head. And I think that's really sadly, what we're at here. It doesn't mean that kids can't be kids and they can't work out their processes. And I'm not trying to take politics out of it. But the Constitution has to create some line of fairness, some line at which I can't hold my politicians accountable anymore. The system is so asymmetrical, so rigged that I can't overcome it. In North Carolina, we had, so biggest swing post-Watergate, and every candidate running partisan statewide who won was a Democrat. And we didn't move one district. We didn't flip one district. So I think it's a call to reason that at some point we have to impose some sort of norm, some sort of constitutional line. And that's where, we're pushing the court toward.
So can I, Ben, did you want to have anything to say more about this? Sorry, one last question, then we can open up to questions. I was struck by your point that we don't know what's fair unless we know what's possible. I'm also struck by, Allison, your call for that there ought to be more transparency. You also talked about transparency, but from a different vantage point, right? Transparency of the data, trying to understand what is happening, as well as when Chief Justice Roberts was talking about gobbledygook, I think what he meant to say is, look, we're not sure what is going on. We may simply need to take somebody's word for it that this is 10 to the 44th fractal, and I have no idea what that means. I'm not even sure that I'm using it right. So how then can we have the transparency and the, you want to hold people accountable to both have faith in what is happening behind the curtain, and also to be able to harmonize the legal standard with the math, right? So do both sides of you, that is the lawyers and the political scientists and mathematicians, do you all think about that? Steve, do you think about that when you're testifying, you're writing your expert report? And how do you all resolve those types of questions?
Usually there's somebody who brought me in and they have a perspective, and I'm there to answer the questions, the data questions that they have about the situation. But they have a perspective, a goal. They've mapped it out. I'm just part of some bigger narrative that they're trying to tell. And I am, in that case, always part of a process. I'm not driving the process. I'm just a piece of information. Ultimately, though, the expert finally works for the court. It's hard to balance those two things. I think that's a complicated thing if anybody gets into this. Hard thing to balance, like somebody's asking you the questions, but maybe you see other things along the way that bear on this. And very frequently the judges will just ask you questions from the bench, like, what do you think of this? And you just got to answer. So the process, the analytical contribution is pretty confined and defined, but it is to answer, in the legal question for me, to answer a question that's been posed to me, usually nothing more than that. So it's not, I'm not really like the wizard behind the scenes doing things, unless I'm brought in like somebody like Nate Pursley to draw a map as a special master for a court. And then that's a different setting. That's something we didn't talk about. But there are people who are occasionally brought in to draw maps for courts. Maybe technologies such as the ones Moon's describing give you a set of maps to choose among, an easier way to see alternative worlds, so it might even make the special master job easier. So I can see lots of ways in which the technologies, the improvements to the technologies might make these different pieces better, but I ultimately don't think the analytics are going to drive it. We're just there to answer some questions.
Yeah, I really take the point about the wizard and the problems there. And I'll say this, when I started getting heavily involved in the math here, I got so frustrated that the Mattingly team, the Chen team, the Cho team wouldn't share their code or data, that we just built our own, and it's awesome and open source. Whoops. So let me tell you, good, I'll use this opportunity to tell you where to find that. I'm a mathematician, so my medium of choice is chalk. So my group, the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering group, we have this website. And if you go there, you can play with our MCMC yourself and build your own districts, set the criteria that you care about. By the way, that's what's really powerful about this, the states have different criteria. You heard about that. You can code them in. You can do your best to operationalize them and try to code them in. You can see how much the outcome depends on the way that you balanced the priorities. You can start to answer questions about what was taken into account by changing those different settings. And actually I want to mention while I'm here, we also have a brand new hot off the presses analysis of the Virginia case, which Steve was also involved in, which is, I think, the first time that this MCMC sampling approach has been used to think about racial gerrymandering. So I want to, that's something that is brand new, and I love anybody's feedback on. So that's a place to look for some of what we're doing. But yeah, so I think that, the point was made earlier about more widely available technology for making maps. Dave's redistricting app was awesome. It's a little bit out of date now. I hope it is.
He just redid it.
That's awesome. That's great news. But more and more, our group had a series of hackathons like the one that you had here. And we've got lots of people thinking about how to democratize the tools to make people, to make it more possible to scope out that world of possibilities for yourself. So some of the things, I think, when you draw maps yourself, you start to appreciate some of the trade-offs. It gives you the ability to assess claims like perfect population balance drives bad shapes. Building maps lets you start to see how those trade-offs take place. And then sampling gives you a very powerful, large-scale technique to see, as you were saying, different realms of possibility than what you had before. Tiny little example of that to end the thought with. Some notoriously ugly districts have a nice story behind them, how they got so ugly. So an example of that, a famous one, is the Earmuffs district in Chicago, Illinois 4, right? So it's like two lobes of population strung together along a highway. And it looks very bad. It's also very high percentage Latino. It elected Luis Gutierrez, I think, 12 or 13 straight elections, never with less than 75% of the vote. It looks very packed. But the story of its creation is that civil rights groups and the DOJ were involved in trying to create a Latino opportunity district without sacrificing 3 nearby African-American opportunity districts. And so the story goes, it had to look that bad to do that. And what's so cool about sampling is one of the things is that it lets you assess that. And it turns out it did not have to be that ugly in order to accomplish that goal, right? And so the worlds of possibilities are so big that it might not always be easy to stumble your way into the right part of the search space, if that makes sense. And so yeah, I think these kinds of tools also give you a wider view of what's possible within the constraints and preferences that are in place.
Either of you want to weigh in before we open it up?
Just that the threat of litigation means that if you're a legislative caucus drawing a map, you have to have a justification for every line in that map. And so the transparency in the process occurs at least on sort of the official court record level, if not the political interchange, it's the bargaining amongst the legislators.
All right, we have time for...
It wasn't very
Okay, we have time for questions. I'm going to do this the way that I do my class. So we're going to start on the top with a young person, yes, in the back. They're all young person. I know they're all young.
Hi, thank you. This is for anyone who wants to take it. I've been thinking a lot as you've been talking about the case we see in this recent election in Maine where we see ranked choice voting for the first time. And if this becomes more popular, is this just a tweak in your models, something to additionally program, or is the concept of electing a candidate of your choice fundamentally changed when you can choose and rank more than one that kind of blows up everything we've already known about redistricting and redistricting litigation?
Actually, I'd like to know what
So
your group would think of that.
we've tried to, and there's been a few instances where limited voting, cumulative voting, ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting has been proposed as a remedy in a Voting Rights Act case where the traditional remedy of drawing a majority Black, majority Latino district isn't an option, either because it looks crazy or you just can't physically do it. I've been working with voters for 15 years. Voters can be, and this is across the country, across race and ethnicity and age, resistant to change. We had one experiment in North Carolina with instant runoff voting in courts of appeals races where in one case we had 19 candidates. And then you get someone elected with 10% of the vote, and no one really wanted that person anyway, and so it's weird. I like it as an option. I think that it's hard to overstate how much voter education has to go into that for it to be practical.
But given the fact that the court might strike down Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, shouldn't the civil rights groups be completely way ahead of this process?
Yes.
Right? I mean, this is the part that, as I know I'm an academic, which makes me not very valuable, but prophetic. I've always been dumbfounded by the resistance of the civil rights community, given what is almost assuredly coming down the pike.
But it's not necessarily us, it's our clients, right? I may think that a limited voting option for my clients is the best thing in the world. And I'm stuck with them saying, heck no.
What are you going to tell them when Section 2 is no longer possible?
They will deal with that when it comes, apparently. I mean, I can't force my clients to seek a remedy they don't want.
Can I just
Yes,
comment on that
please.
real quick?
And then you're
So
next.
we did do some modeling that looked at different, in particular, we were looking at Santa Clara, California, which was sued by Asian civil rights groups for the city council elections. And we were able to model how different types of transferable vote schemes would perform. I love ranked choice because I think secretly what a lot of people see as a touchstone for fairness is proportionality. We don't have rules about that, but we understand that ranked choice gets us there, and you don't get it for free from single-member districts. Now, Maine's really interesting. They passed ranked choice. They're using it for Senate, for Congress, but we have a rule that says Congress has to have single-member districts. So it's ranked choice, but not statewide, right? It's ranked choice within the districts, which is, you still have to do a districted analysis for that, for Congress, even if you move to
I suspect that for civil rights questions, ranked choice voting is the worst option because you have a white liberal, a black, and a conservative running.
I
A
disagree.
white liberal, well, this is what, it shows that the white liberal gets listed second by the black voters. You create a district, maybe the white liberals aren't willing to say that they're racist, and the white gets listed more often, so the black might come in first with 37% of the vote, but when the votes are redistributed, the white liberal wins.
So our Santa Clara analysis seemed to say that nothing else performs as well as a citywide transferable vote because of vote splitting in a different way. The Asian community has an East Asian subset and a South Asian subset that split their votes, but that can, because of second and third choices, show up much better when you have a transferable scheme.
And here's the least favorite
I
answer
think-
that no one will like, which is there's
I'm
not
gonna-
a one-size-fits-all. Like what might work there isn't going to work in the Deep
Not gonna
South.
work in the
Mail-in voting works in the Pacific Northwest. There would be huge resistance to that in my state.
I would say give them a Section 2 option. Yes, in the green.
Until Section 2 dies.
Yeah, I have a question about the uniformity of Massachusetts.
You have to please wait for the mic.
Yeah. Quick question about the uniformity of Massachusetts voters. So a third of the state did vote for Trump, and WBUR did a poll where they showed a town-by-town breakdown of that, and you saw that actually a third of the towns were majority Trump voters, and they tended to be clustered near each other in the southern and central part of the state. And also, the Massachusetts State House of Reps is 20% Republicans. So can you help me understand why it's not possible to get a single
Sure.
Republican district?
Yeah, there's a pattern, especially in the Trump vote. There's this I-shaped pattern in the middle of the state. Yeah, I've been staring at these maps for a long time. I'd love to talk more about this. But there aren't enough. So the Trump race performs fascinatingly differently from go all the way back to 2000 and look at Gore-Bush. Both Trump and Bush got 35% of the statewide vote, but how it's spatialized is really different. So it is possible to make a Trump favoring piece of the state that's 1/9 of the state. It is not possible with Bush, right? I'd love to talk to you more about why that is. The trend over the last 2 census cycles here in Massachusetts has been to more variance and more spatial patterning. But especially if you look at elections between 2000 and 2010, that's where you see this remarkable uniformity and low variance.
It's because there isn't enough population concentrated sufficiently. You need 700,000 people for a congressional district, but we have a couple hundred state legislative districts. So it's easy to draw a bunch of little state legislative districts scattered about, but really hard to make something that's got 700,000 people that's 350,000 Republicans.
Well, yeah, and just to make that really stark, let me give you my favorite example. The Kennedy-Chase Senate race in 2006. There are 300 and some towns, I can't remember the exact number of towns in Massachusetts. There were over 2,000 precincts, and true fact, 9 of those precincts had Chase majorities, despite the fact that Chase got 30% of the vote. So getting from 30% to 50% just didn't happen very much, and that's really low variance. Everything was in the 30s.
All right, I can take one more, but I'll squeeze in 2. So one on this side and one in the back. I'm sorry for the rest of you with your hands up. My apologies. Yes, sir, you in the checkered shirt. You are next. Yes. I'm sorry, you and then he's
Oh, okay. So in Mattingly's model, he uses compactness as one of his measures for high probability districts. But in today's sociological environment where retail centers disappear, compactness was a measure of community way in the past. People are interacting online however they do, and the sense of community is not so geographically tied. Mm-hmm. So maybe those old, strange, geographically gerrymandered districts are reasonable ones.
Yeah.
Well, just hold up. Let's take the other one, and then we can answer both of them at the same time.
I've just been struck that public opinion around gerrymandering has not come up at all in this talk, and I'm curious if A, there is strong public opinion, and B, if that's ever come into play in practice in a gerrymandering process.
All right, so 2 questions. Let's answer them and then wrap it up.
Fusing them both for a moment, compactness is one place that public opinion comes in, right? So all the definitions of compactness that are circulating are kind of silly, let's just admit it. But bad shapes are a strong driver of negative public opinion. And actually, if you look at the Shaw line of Supreme Court decisions in the 90s, one interpretation that I find persuasive is that what the court was saying is that bad shape, North Carolina 12 itself, the district that launched 1,000 lawsuits, NC 12's bad shape made people feel that race predominated. And that was a big part of the legal logic about what was wrong with it. So that's a place where compactness and public opinion tie in. I tend to think compactness, that's a longer story, so ask me later. Okay.
Steve, do you want to talk about public opinion?
It's not really a driver in this domain. It doesn't show up in court cases at all. It's hard to get really a lot of impetus behind reform. There are a few states that have passed ballot measures, but it's actually been pretty hard to mobilize it. It's never a top issue of people, so.
And so I'm a strong believer that bad redistricting reform is worse than none at all. And so sometimes, I don't think it's public opinion so much, but you say, everyone I talk to says, of course there's gerrymandering. I mean, and I think there's gerrymandering. I worry though that to the extent it ever does become a motivating force, then it, no one's paying attention to the details and the implications, and so that may not be super helpful.
Yeah. Oh, actually, one thing is true. Like, a large majority of Americans do not like the creation of majority black districts. So.
Well, there are
Then you
lots
get
of
the last
polls that if you ask people do you like it that politicians are creating their own districts? The answer is no, but there's never been a race, legislative, congressional, any level, where voters have gone to the polls because of gerrymandering.
Everyone hates Congress but likes their own congressperson. It's sort of the same sort of thing. Like, yeah, it's a problem, but mine's fine. It's not a big deal.
All right, let's give them a hand of applause. And now it's my pleasure to turn this over to Steve to wrap us up.
All right. First of all, before we all break, I want to thank everybody who participated in the hackathon, Guy and others who ran the sessions, all the participants on the panels. It was a fantastic day. I'd like to thank Harris Interactive, Andrew Tanesho, Scott Rasmussen, MIT's Election Data Sciences Lab, IQSS for their support throughout. I'd like to send a special thanks to all the staff, the AV guys who helped run things, Armel and Liz and others who helped greet everybody and make sure everything worked. And a very special thanks to Laura Donaldson, who did an enormous amount of work putting this together. I'd like to thank Shannon and Stephen Pettigrew. Stephen, there you are, for all your work on this meeting. And of course, thank you to Ryan and thank you to Kirk. And with that, we are adjourned.
Thank you for being so kind.